truly overwhelmed with gratitude that so many of you accepted our invitation to this conversation that we're going to be having in the next 90 minutes. And the purpose of this event is twofold. First, we want to share findings from our mapping of the impact of US government funding cuts on African civil society organizations. So what happened, and what does it mean? And here I would like to thank the more than 500 organizations that responded to our survey. Thank you for your generosity and willingness to share your experience. Without you, the report we are launching today would not have been possible. Our second objective is to start a conversation about what's next. In the context of heavy debt burden across the continent and shrinking aid budgets, many African governments now spend more on debt servicing than on health or education. And this makes the role of civil society organizations as providers of essential services and protectors of civic space more urgent than ever before. And this is one of the reasons why we decided to carry out our survey. We wanted to understand the depth and the nature of the crisis. Although in the immediate aftermath of the funding cuts, we saw many anecdotal reports in the media and a handful of survey reports had been published. As of the time we launched our survey in March, there wasn't, and there still isn't, really any comprehensive assessment of the impact of the funding cuts on African CSOs and the communities that they serve. Our survey is the first attempt to begin to understand this impact at a Pan-African level and offers pathways towards a sector-wide transformation. Now, let me introduce my colleague, David Bernard, who will walk us through the key findings in the report. Now, David has dedicated his decades-long career to advancing African NGO development, philanthropy, and social impact across Africa. He has led initiatives that have strengthened civil society, mobilized resources, and fostered cross-regional learning to drive systemic change. He previously served as EPIC Africa's program director and continues to support EPIC Africa's special projects, including the mapping of the impact of the US government funding cuts and our forthcoming African CSO Awards initiative. David, over to you.
Very good. The presentation. Is the slides running? Okay, perfect. Thanks, Paul. Okay. Thank you, Rose, for your very kind introduction. On behalf of African NGOs, I also want to thank everyone who participated in our survey and joined today for this very critical conversation and the launch of our report. As Rose indicated, my task for the next 15 to 20 minutes is to reflect on what we did and to highlight the key learnings from the survey findings. Rose and I will also be available at the end of the panel discussion if anyone has any questions about the survey findings. So, first slide. So I think it's very important right at the outset just to establish what we did and kind of who participated and what I say some of the key or core characteristics of the African CSOs that participated in our survey. So in terms of the background, which I think many of you are familiar with, the US government was the largest bilateral donor at the time of the Trump administration's announcement in January 25 regarding its plans to re-evaluate all its foreign assistance. From the outset, it was evident that any funding changes or cuts would have far-reaching implications for Africa in general and African CSOs specifically. As a result, African NGOs and EPIC Africa, as Rose highlighted, we started planning our survey project in mid-February and implemented an online survey over 3 weeks from 17 March to the 4th of April. It is still the only Pan-African effort to understand the impact of the US funding cuts on African CSOs. In total, we received 551 responses. After removing incomplete and other submissions, we were left with 364 responses from 40 African countries. We divided these CSOs into two groups, and it's very important to understand the two groups to really understand the implications of the findings. Those which were recipients of USG funding at the time of the Trump administration's announcement, which we refer to as directly impacted, as well as those which were not recipients of USG funding, but were affected by the fallout and consequences of the funding cuts, which we refer to as indirectly impacted. The findings that I'm sharing with you and the findings highlighted in the report primarily focus on CSOs that lost funding and that were directly impacted. However, the experiences of indirectly impacted CSOs are also reflected in the report, and I will reference some of the findings in my presentation. 364 respondents represent a sizable sample size. Although we will be the first to acknowledge it is not an all-inclusive sample of all USG-funded and directly impacted African CSOs. Many others were also affected. One of the challenges we faced in identifying and engaging affected CSOs is the absence of a comprehensive publicly available list of all USG-funded African CSOs, especially as those funded through various intermediaries. Based on the survey findings, we learned that 68.3% of all respondents were funded through intermediaries. So many of the names that we read about in the news were people that received funding directly from US government agencies. It's the money that they passed on, or the funding that they passed on. There's no list of who those recipients were. Also, many CSOs decided not to participate. Important point, because they feared potential repercussions for speaking out, and we also had a number of respondents that participated anonymously. For anyone interested in just better understanding the makeup of the 364, or more specifically, the 234 directly affected CSOs, they represent a very diverse group of African CSOs. Many folk work at the local, at the community and the national levels. They're fairly mature in age, with more than 60% of them more than 10 years old. The nature of their work, they focus primarily on advocacy, capacity building, service delivery. Their thematic focus covers issues primarily like health, HIV/AIDS, education, human rights, and climate change. They are, however, relatively small in terms of staff size, with almost 60% of them employing less than 20 people, and almost 30% less than 10 people. In terms of 2024 revenue, 35% generated less than $100,000, while 8% generated more than $10 million. In terms of sources of funding, which is, I think, also an important issue to recognize, is that international NGOs represent 63.8% of their funding sources, which are very much aligned with, say, the reference to intermediaries. International foundations, 50.2%, bilateral and multilateral agencies, 36.2%, and individual donors and crowdfunding, a further 32.1%. Obviously, most organizations are not single-funded and rely on a diverse range of funders for income sources. So next slide. So now we get into the main findings. 15 or 20 minutes don't really allow us to go very deep into most of the findings and our learnings, but the whole idea of this presentation is really to highlight at the high level the key issues that we learned about in the survey and the survey findings. I think it's also important to remember that the survey findings reflect CSOs' experiences 2 months into the USG funding freeze. For many, the impact was immediate and far-reaching. It was never a case of a temporary freeze or disruption, but a permanent loss of funding from the outset. The initial decision to freeze was never changed or overturned. 46.5% of respondents indicated that they already received termination notices at the time of participating in the survey. The loss of funding was significant. Many African CSOs have been beneficiaries of USG funding for many years, and USG funding represented a substantial portion of their overall funding. As you can see at the top of the circle on the left, 35.4% of CSOs received more than 50% of their overall funding from USG in 2024. A further 16% received between 31 and 50% of their overall funding from USG. Based on the funding cuts at the bottom of the circle, and very significant, 38.3% indicated that they lost more than 50% of their total funding for 2025 following the USG funding cuts. The repercussions of those funding cuts I will highlight next. But very briefly, again, probably just to give some context and for people interested in understanding the funding dynamics around USG funding. So, as I highlighted earlier, most of USG funding came via intermediaries, 68.3%. A further 17.7% received their funding direct, and then a combination of both intermediary and direct, 14% received their funding in that way. The funding sources, or the USG government funding sources, include primarily USAID that was responsible for 70.8% of all USG funding, PEPFAR another 24.7%, the State Department 12.3%, and then a whole scattering of various US agencies were also channels for and sources of funding of African CSOs. The type of funding or the form in which African CSOs received the funding were mainly sub-grants, 64%, project funding, 61%, and only 10.3% of African CSOs received core support from USG sources. Next slide, please. This slide really takes us to the crux of the matter. So if we look beyond, say, the loss of funding, then we really get a real sense of what were the real fallout, implications, and consequences of the funding cuts. They impacted organizational goals and survival, community support and service delivery, and very significantly, they impacted trust, as reflected in the quote at the bottom. As you can see on the slide, organizational goals, very significant. 55.6% of CSOs indicated that their operations have been severely impacted and they will be unable to achieve their goals for 2025. In terms of the impact on communities, which I think is a significant finding, almost two-thirds of respondents, or 64.6%, reported that the communities they serve are severely impacted, with critical services discontinued. And then looking ahead, in terms of long-term survival, 64% of respondents indicated that the funding cuts threaten their long-term survival. It's not a rosy picture, and the rosy picture of April hasn't necessarily improved by the end of July. However, the fallout also impacted the work of non-USG funded CSOs, as I mentioned in my introductory comments. This is evident in the communities they serve and the increased demand for their services. Although their funding and organizational goals were relatively unaffected, 41.3% reported service disruptions to communities due to downstream dependency on frozen projects, sub-grants, and shared infrastructure. Very important, this illustrates how deeply interconnected the African civil society ecosystem is, and the US funding cuts cause sector-wide disruption. Next slide. So in my final two slides, I want to focus on what CSOs did in response and then how they see the way forward. Again, there's a lot more detail that one can cover and reflect on to paint the full picture. But again, for the sake of today's conversation and to provide some context to the panel discussion. This slide captures the immediate steps many CSOs took in response to the funding cuts, ultimately impacting their ability to achieve their goals and provide services to various communities. The immediate response was not about long-term sustainability, but about short-term survival and crisis management. Now, if you look at, say, the table and the information in the slide, the steps that they've taken, almost if you used sporting language, was a balance between being offensive and defensive. Defensively, we can see they cancelled or reduced program activities. They closed or downsized operations. They delayed planned projects, and in many cases, very sadly, they reduced staff. That was very much the defensive steps that they took to almost safeguard the organizations and their work in the short term. On the offensive side, clearly efforts around increased local fundraising, securing alternative funding, etc. Importantly, we also learned about CSO's efforts to raise awareness and support through signed petitions, engaging governments, and exploring new fundraising strategies. They also shared with us their immediate needs in terms of support, which range from technical assistance on resource mobilization and proposal writing, networking and partnership opportunities with alternative funders, capacity strengthening on financial sustainability, and advocacy support for policy changes. Next slide, please. So, what was the way forward by mid-April, and what is still the situation today? By early April, when we closed the survey, the situation for many USG-funded CSOs looked bleak. The circles on the left and the right reflect CSOs' lack of confidence in the future. Furthermore, as I already highlighted, based on the funding cuts, 64% of CSOs indicated their organizations face an existential threat. Only 18.3% secured funding for short-term relief, while 86.9% indicated that they have not identified or secured any long-term funding to replace their USG funding. The situation is becoming even more dire for many past USG funding CSOs and others. We still see daily reports about CSOs closing down, downscaling their operations, or highlighting how difficult it is to secure funding in a fast-changing and increasingly competitive funding environment. Furthermore, other bilateral funders have also announced their intention to reduce foreign aid or have already introduced cuts. This situation is unsustainable, and something needs to change. We have been here before, during and after COVID, when CSOs' funding and operations were also disrupted. But this time it is different. Most funding returned after COVID, while the USG funding cuts are permanent. It is therefore a blessing in disguise that we didn't publish our survey findings and recommendations soon after the survey closed. We had time to reflect on and dissect the findings and the ongoing changes and challenges confronting African CSOs. We were also looking for inspiration from CSOs to craft and draft our recommendation. In conclusion, despite the challenges CSOs face, their resilience always comes to the fore. The quote at the bottom reflects that, while the need for change and a new approach is perfectly captured in the response to one of the final survey questions, with 93.8% of CSOs indicating their interest and willingness to work with others affected CSOs in finding solutions to the challenges facing them individually and collectively. With that, I hand back to Rose to introduce the second part of the webinar, which will focus on what's next and the main recommendation captured in our report. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Yeah, so this is where we find ourselves, not a rosy picture at all, but at the same time, not a hopeless. People are not hopeless. So like most reports, our report also ended with a list of recommendations for the way forward. And as David said, it's good actually that we didn't rush to publish because it gave us time to really sit back and reflect a bit more on the recommendations that emerged. And the recommendations were not from ourselves; they were what CSOs were saying needed to happen. Now, these recommendations included, actions that CSOs, funders, and governments should undertake. For example, CSOs are often told you must diversify funding, you must look internally, collaborate more, share costs, perhaps even consider merging. For funders, there have been consistent calls to shift power, provide unrestricted long-term support, trust African organizations. And for governments, there have been calls, long-going calls to create a more enabling environment, including creating incentives to encourage local giving and supportive policies and regulations. And the list goes on and on. I think we're all familiar with what has been, excuse me, solutions that have been offered over the past, certainly I would say 5 years or so. But what we quickly realized, or after reflecting, what we realized was that these recommendations actually offered no new insights. And as David said, back in 2020, 2021, when we assessed the impact of COVID on African CSOs, the same recommendations emerged. They are the same prescriptions being discussed even today in other ongoing conversations in other spaces. So it seems to us that the issue before us is not what to do, but rather, or who should do what, but rather it's how to do it. So, we know what to do, or at least the sector seems to know what to do. So the question is, why aren't they doing it? Why isn't this happening? Why aren't organizations diversifying their funding? What's the problem? What is blocking African CSOs from going from knowledge to action? Unfortunately, we don't have answers to these questions. Instead, what we have are more questions, but we also have an idea that we want to share here, and that ended up being sort of the core recommendation that can help to move the sector from knowledge to action. And the idea is the development of what we're calling a blueprint for African civil society organization sustainability. And what we mean by a blueprint is, a practical African-led framework for what civil society needs to not only survive, which is where we are right now, but to adapt and thrive amid current and future shifting global and domestic funding landscapes. Now, this blueprint in our thinking must center African leadership and context. It must engage all stakeholders, governments, donors, intermediaries, and communities. And it must be actionable and inclusive with pathways to immediate and longer term outcomes. So to encourage this process, we propose potential action pathways, and you see that in the report. And yes, the report will be shared. I've seen many questions whether we're going to share the report. Yes, we will at the end of this webinar. So we are proposing, action pathways that align with the report's 4 strategic pillars, which are around capital, around systems, around partnerships, and of course, innovation. And we suggest roles for each of these of the stakeholders. But we do this with great humility and not as a prescription, but as a place to start ideating around a blueprint. So that's what we're recommending. And now, I'm going to turn to our moderator of the day, Nyasha Njela, who is going to moderate the panel discussion. And Nyasha is many things, and I cannot list all her accomplishments, but just in short, she's a community and social services professional. She's an experienced fundraiser. She's skilled in nonprofit organizations, donor development, public speaking. I think she's just the perfect person to be leading, helping us navigate this discussion. Nyasha, please.
Thank you, Rose. Oh my goodness. In reading this report, many emotions came to light. But let me start off by saying good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone that's on the call, wherever in the world you are. I think today we're coming here, it's such a timely and important conversation to have. And thank you to Epic Africa for producing this report. As Rose said, my name is Nyasha Njela, and I have the privilege of moderating today's discussion. And what brings us together today is a report, and it's not just a report, but it's actually a moment of reckoning and a moment for us to reimagine. The first time that Rose spoke about a blueprint, I couldn't get it out of my mind. But we also need to recognize that behind this report, there were statistics and lots of them, but there's a human element and a human cost. There are people affected. There are our brothers and sisters in the industry who were affected, who lost jobs. The communities that we serve who lost services. So that needs to be honored as well. And we can't turn a blind eye to that. But what does that also mean? I think I was encouraged by the last statistic, and thank you, David, for showing that as the last slide and having it on for a long time, because I kept looking at that number, 94%, 93.8% that you showed of organizations that are ready to collaborate. And it took me to a moment where I was thinking about the weight of all of this over the last couple of weeks, and I found myself imagining if I could be back at any moment in time, even before my birth, what would that moment be? And I landed on May 1963 in Addis Ababa. The Organization of African Unity was born, which is now called the African Union. Leaders gathered not because the future was guaranteed, but because they believed it could be shaped. They met in the middle of a crisis and started to dream about possibility. They dreamt about a blueprint for Africa. Much like today, I'm honored to be joined by 3 leaders who navigated this crisis firsthand. Grace Maingi from KCDF in East Africa, Dr. Taurai Tafuma from Zimbabwe Health Interventions in Southern Africa, and Pap Gaye from Baobab Institute in Francophone West Africa. Together, they will reflect on the diverse regions, the models and the responses that they had in navigating all of this, and what we need to think about as we redesign and we rethink this blueprint. We'll start by moderating the panel discussion, and then we'll open up to the floor to hear from you, our broader community, because this is not just a launch. It's a call to co-create a new blueprint. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to start off with each one of you asking, and if you could answer this question. Each of you led an organization that was directly affected by recent withdrawal of US government funding. Could you briefly introduce yourself and share how these cuts have impacted your organization, your people, your programs, the communities, and the communities that you serve? I'm going to start off with you, Grace.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Nyasha, and to Epic Africa for putting this together, and to everyone who responded to the survey. As I've been introduced, my name is Grace Maingi. I work in Nairobi, Kenya, for the Kenya Community Development Foundation. And we were a direct recipient of USAID funding, which after many months of working on the proposal, going through the assessment process, we were happy to receive. And we were happy to receive that funding because we recognized that there was a shift to ensure that there was more support to local organizations here in Kenya. And so that was monumental for us because through years of lobbying and advocacy and speaking to capacity of local organizations to undertake the work, there was that recognition that the funding was important. I think for us, in terms of the work we were hoping to do, I must honor those who were doing that work and those who were looking to see what we could do in terms of building capacity support. We had a grant for capacity support for local organizations. We also had a grant for support around civic space in terms of public benefit organizations and what we could do around that. So for the communities that we were serving, what has happened is that our vision of greater civic engagement in Kenya through that work has been cut short. Our vision of being able to have greater civil society engagement on issues around the legislative framework has been cut short. And that has been a great impact to the communities that we serve. I would say at the people and program level, we had to quickly see how we could survive through the crisis. And I took time to speak to a friend of mine who also works in the sector, who also received USAID funds. And for her, she described it so aptly that she felt immense grief with this process, because apart from having to navigate the process from a point of leadership with strength and clarity, she recognized the cost, because the work that they were doing was around healthcare accountability in Kenya. And so the immense grief that she felt around that. Other widespread effects that we've seen is, unfortunately, even for those who are not directly working on this program, we had an incident where one of our banks actually said we were on a blacklist because we were receiving USAID funding and that funding had been cut. And so our risk profile increased. And so the ramifications have been there, even in terms of the organizations that we were supporting, asking us, what next? Why can't you look for other funding to support this work? And us not being able to say, yes, we already have it, it's there, was a very painful experience. So let me pause there to give my other colleagues on the panel a chance to chip in. Thank you, Nyasha.
Thank you, Grace. I think there are 2 points that you just made there, which is, I can't stop thinking about the fact that you spoke about immense grief, and we really have to sit with that for a little bit. But also another point is to hear that you are blacklisted. If this is a call for not only civil society to play a part in this, but also everyone to take a part in this blueprint, where would corporate Africa find itself in this space? And it's something we need to think about as we're creating this blueprint. What does that partnership look like? Because if civil society organizations are to be blacklisted instead of uplifted, where are we going? I'm going to go to you, Dr. Taurai, with the same question that I asked Grace.
Thank you, Nyasha, and good evening and good morning and afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Taurai Tafuma. I'm the Executive Director for Zimbabwe Health Interventions, which is an NGO that offers comprehensive services at community level, focusing on building long-term capacity of our institution with the intent of ensuring sustainability. I think just like what Grace has indicated, the cards and the way they were pronounced in our own setting, we were considering that this is an unprecedented period which we have been presented with, mainly because on the way it had happened, it was so abrupt. In particular for the Zimbabwe Health Interventions, These cuts resulted in the organization losing approximately 45% of its funding, and we had to terminate almost 210 staff contracts. We had to stop programming activities in 11 of the 19 districts which we were in. More importantly, the programs that were cut, fortunately, we had to remain with one, but the other that were terminated were essentially in the preventive sector. And in these programs, the advantage which we had picked was that we had gone almost, this was our 4th year, so we had happened to understand the needs of our communities, and we were bound to, or rather we had started innovating around the programming, which we had started the past 3 years. This would include like economic strengthening, like I indicated that our mandate was to ensure sustainability within the communities. We were also meant, though focusing on HIV prevention, diversify and look at some of the social determinants that would lead some of the adolescent girls and young women into high-risk behaviors. So this was to ensure that the school-going age group would need to remain in school. So we had to partner with the community and the education sector so that at least there's that community and the education sector link, and ensure children are maintained within school. But unfortunately, as we were actually on the rise regarding these initiatives, that's when the terminations were pronounced. So reflecting on what this could have led to is that it has left the tap open in terms of HIV prevention, and there is an anticipation of an increased number of new HIV infections. Being that we are targeting young women and adolescent girls, it's no surprise that teenage pregnancy would also increase. Dropouts from school leading to illicit drug use would also quite be prevalent within these vulnerable populations. But again, at community level, being that we had to lay off approximately 200 people I had indicated, and the way it had happened that it was so abrupt, it means these officers, they left the work environment without any preparations to cater for the coming months or period. And then ultimately, this would lead to financial constraint and possibly difficult livelihoods within the same communities. Regardless, our initiative and their initial activities while they were implementing, it was more centered on economic strengthening. So they will become part of the candidates who would also require the same economic strengthening. So ultimately, we are creating more of a vicious cycle, which will be very difficult to control. At organizational level, as I conclude, is that the fact that the cuts were so abrupt, which from my own opinion would have wished that probably even as they were anticipated that they were coming, probably would have been given 3 to almost the end of the September calendar period, where usually the year-end funding would come to an end, and then allow our staff members to plan. So we are likely to face some litigation, mainly because of these abrupt cuts, regardless that the staff do understand that organizations like ours, they do depend on donor funding. So despite these challenges, we remain committed to working closely with the government and the other civil society organizations, as well as developmental partners like you have indicated, including the private sector, so that at least we can continue providing services as well as capacitating such potential providers in the areas where these terminations have been instituted. Otherwise, thanks, and back to you, Nyasha.
Thank you, Taurai. With you, Pap, I'm going to take a little bit of liberty as the moderator and actually extend this question a little bit more, because two things, I mean, from what Grace had spoken about when it came to the bank side, and now what Taura is talking about. We are employers in civil society, right? Civil society organizations are employers. And therefore, when people are retrenched, you also are open to litigation like any other company that is out there, like any other organization. And that is something that is seemingly forgotten in all of this, because it's not, we're multifaceted. We're supposed to operate in the civil society space, but also operate as a corporate structure. What does that mean in the face of all of this? So I want you to answer the question, but also a reflection from your side in looking at, we are also having to navigate business in a corporate space, in an environment where we have to take care of people that are our staff members.
Yes.
How does that play out with everything that's happening?
Very, very important question, and thank you for asking it. And I wanted to thank you, the organizers, EPIC Africa, African NGO, for putting together this event. In fact, it's so important and it is so timely for our sector to be focusing really on the root causes of why we're going through what we're going through today. And I want to insist on that, on taking a deep look, because there are some structural issues that we're going to need to face. But let me answer the question first. You know, the Baobab Institute is really a startup. It's a young organization we set up about 3 years ago, for the specific purposes of doing our part into catalyzing a change, a paradigm shift in development. Basically, we feel that the current model we've been using for 50 years, has now been upended, and that there is a call for a new model of development. And we've decided at Baobab Institute to focus our energy on that, meaning how do we find local solutions to local problems. So it was a big hit when USAID, after awarding us a generous $5 million project, decided to cancel this. So you can imagine how a starting organization that has actually done very well landing a project of that size, just woke up one morning to say, hey, we only have half of the resources we thought we had, because that project actually represented half of our current size of our company. You know, I want, well, very much because I think my colleagues presented the impact. Obviously, the impact on the community was just anticipated since we had not really started implementation. But the regions that were chosen was where statistics for maternal and child health are still pretty bad. And these are regions that really, and communities that really needed the work to strengthen maternal and newborn health. So incredible impact. But if you allow me, I want to focus on kind of the impact on organizations. And I think this is really the issue that we're faced with, because suddenly we saw a behavior from Moderna that not only undid a lot of the things that they managed to build in the last few years, but also put a big dent on, you know, how do we do this work moving forward? And I wanna, yes, this is about running businesses. This is about setting up organizations, even though it's very difficult for civil society organization. But we recognize that the only way we're going to succeed is running as tightly as possible the small businesses or mid-sized businesses or whatever that we are running. And let's face it, money is extremely important. In French, they say it's le nerf de la guerre. It's basically the nerve of the war. But basically, that's the most important part. If you don't have that resources, you're just not going to do it. But I do think there is need not to take this lightly, but to look deep about why this is happening. Somebody at the beginning said this happened after COVID. This is not the first time this is happening. But why is this happening periodically? And what do we need to do so that we don't repeat this? I think taking a good look at root cause, doing a root cause analysis so that we can understand the assumptions that underline our sector. Can we really call ourselves civil society organization when more than half of us are still very dependent, or in a lot of cases, still linked to foreign donors or international organizations? If you sift through the package of organizations on our continent, you will find out that actually the percentage of indigenous truly with their own vision, their own stated missions, I think we're few. And in Francophone Africa, we're even fewer. The ecosystem is even less strong. So our task is actually even bigger. So my problem when our grant was cut was mostly the local organization that we had selected to benefit from our technical assistance and from our support throughout this project. And nobody even talks about them. So there's so many organizations that need support, but we are so much in the way because we are still running the agenda of the donors or the agenda of the stronger organization of the INGOs. So I want to invite us to do a couple of things. One is to really have a focus on our landscape so that we can strengthen it. What's missing, what's going to strengthen the community as a sector, not just as individual organization. And I want to encourage us as leaders and actors to get into some introspection about what role we ourselves might be having in continuing this thing we're trying to change. I don't know if I'm making myself understood. To what extent, me, Pop Guy, am I contributing to perpetrating what we wish to change? Because if I'm an employee of an international organization, if I'm a recipient of a donor, that donor already wants me to go a certain way and I'm following them. So I just want you to think about that a little bit. I want us to think a little bit about the part that we can do something about. And that is one of them. A deep reflection about the role we are playing in continuing what we're actually trying to change. Maybe as an introduction, I should just stop there so I don't take too much time. But the impact, it's horrible, horrible on communities. But we don't talk about it, but I think it was even worse on the task which is most important, which is to strengthen the ecosystem of civil society organization. And that's why I'm so excited about the blueprint that Nyasha has introduced and to see what is it that we need to do. But that's where we find ourselves today. So let me just stop there with those initial thoughts. and wait for your additional question, Nyasha.
Thank you, thank you. You know, when you're a moderator and one of your participants actually goes rogue, one of your panelists goes rogue, and then they go ahead of you, this is exactly what PUP has done. Where I don't know whether I should be asking my second and my third question or the
Please
fourth question.
do.
But but thank you very much for that. I think what I do want to leave, Pap, I'll come back to. I'll circle back to you. You spoke about something right at the end where you said strengthening the ecosystem, and you had spoken about our reliance on international funding. But then a challenge that I would say is that one would argue that allies are actually good for us, right? So if we do have international funders on our side, then we can start making some changes. And then I go back to your statement about strengthening the ecosystem and rather using this as a moment of how do we collaborate differently when it comes to that, because allies are still important, that
Yes.
funding is still important, but how do we create a blueprint that encourages all of it? Taurai, I'm going to come to you. Pap, you reflect on that, and then I'll come back to you on that question. Taurai, I'll come to you and Grace. And there's something that Rose said where she spoke about the fact that, and also David, we've been here before during COVID, right? You know, if we are to look at this experience within your organizations, and we kind of zoom out a little bit because we're not working in isolation. In the countries that you're in, or also in the regions that you're in, there are other organizations in the sector that have been affected, right? This space that we find ourselves in right now as a sector today, how did we find ourselves here? Did we not see the warning signs? And has this experience also taught us how to prevent this going forward? I want us to get to a point where we circle back and start looking at what are the steps that we will make. But can we reflect on that a little bit?
Thank you, Nyasha. I would say unavoidably, our sector is bound to rely on donor funding, probably contrary to what Papa had indicated. But this is something which we are bound to be because we are a non-profit making kind of an organization. However, like you have indicated, we are not operating in a vacuum or in isolation. And that's where the need to make sure we do work with the private sector, other potential funders, be individual philanthropists, even looking beyond the USG, so to say, because being that's the main funder. So we just need to make sure we diversify our sources of funding. The other part is that yes, we were fully aware that these are some of the things that are likely to happen, particularly in this case. I think the anticipation to say there have been administration change or anticipated administration change in the United States, we should have looked ahead. But again, we rely as well on our own local governments, as particularly when I refer to Africa. But I believe some of the countries didn't really put this into consideration as they were reflecting on the changes that were happening in the Western world. So taking, for example, in this case, I think for us, in the to say what could have prevented us from getting where we are, not speaking of, so to say, the organization, but the safe landing of our communities, which we have been serving. I believe, like yesterday, there was another webinar related almost to this one, and more so, what was indicated there is to say there is the Abuja Declaration. You also indicated in your preamble the issue of the OAU. There have been certain agreements that our states have agreed to commit themselves to. But what we have noticed up to now, most of them, they are failing to reach such targets that they have set for themselves. And ultimately, you'd find that when there is a cut like what we have noticed right now, then definitely our communities will suffer most. Our workforce, so to speak, will also suffer the brunt most. But there are lessons that have been learned in other countries. If you refer to UNAIDS kind of reports, in Lesotho, as soon as they realized there were these cuts, they mandated a task force that had to look and make propositions to mitigate the challenges that had been come out of the executive orders pronouncement, said that at least there is task shifting, the affected staff are immediately absorbed within the government sector. They might not be paid to the same level as probably the private or the NGO sector has been paying. But again, it will cushion those who have had their contracts terminated. And furthermore, by virtue of having experienced, capacitated individuals in such government institutions, would also ensure that other members within the government are also capacitated. And then there is continuity of services within the communities that were being served by the affected NGOs. But again, in Botswana, South Africa, we have noticed also that the government was able to pick up on certain funding gaps and the intention to work with the affected institutions. And these are some of the examples which we believe, if as the country, and like David has indicated, looking forward to the blueprint, if we reflect on these good lessons learned, then as we incorporate and come up with the blueprint, we'll ultimately come up with something which can be used to the benefit of our communities as well as our populace. Thanks, and back to you, Nyash.
Thank you very much. I think I want to kind of save Grace from the doom and gloom of it all and get to this blueprint, right? Let's get to the crux of everything. Grace, and I'm going to start with you, where the report's core recommendation is to develop a blueprint for African CSO sustainability. The idea of a blueprint is powerful. It implies a collective vision involving all stakeholders, but it also starts with CSOs themselves examining themselves. How do we ensure that it's not another report or another roadmap? What conditions do you think we need in place to actually start this blueprint? Something that is African-led and can be implemented by Africans and is owned at scale within Africa.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I was ready to dive into the continued doom and gloom, but I'll pull myself away from the brink.
No,
of
we're
it.
done. We're done with that. Let's blueprint away. Let's blueprint away.
Okay.
Now it's time for action, because I do want to hear from our audience. And Mariam, please don't think that you are you're just gonna hide in the dark from this, because we would want to hear as well. So yes, Grace, please go ahead.
Thank you. I think in terms of the blueprint, and I like the fact that we've said it needs to start with introspection. I think fundamentally we need to reflect on how we have been formed and rethink that. We must rethink that, because if we have been birthed or come out of a thinking that the only way we can do our work is through having foreign funding, then we've been set up for this situation and where we are. I think every organization, every leader really needs to sit back and think, if I was to be able to be effective and work and serve communities in a way that communities would actually support my work, what would that look like? I would say that's fundamental in the blueprint, because then it upsets maybe what has been our thinking in terms of who are we most accountable to for what we are doing. So putting communities at the center. And I recognize that like for me, coming from a community foundation, it's easy to say that, but it's something that we must fundamentally rethink how and where we have positioned who we are most accountable to. I would say there are already pockets of work and thinking that is going on around this. We must lean into that. We should not try to reinvent the wheel where people have done research and they've talked discussions about this, having a reemergent system, a different development system, conversations around how do we weave our resilience. We really should tap into that and bring that into the conversation. I think the realization that we're working in a world that is broken. We're working in societies that are unequal and unjust is a reality. And therefore, there will be challenges that we will face. Recognizing that businesses go through this, businesses shut down, very successful businesses, and they shut down. So we are not unique in this, in terms of facing this. But it is our time, and it calls upon us to really be innovative and agile. And even if not for us, but for those who will come to do this work after us. So challenging ourselves, challenging our thinking, talking to each other. I know people feel that we maybe we talk too much and do very little, but I think it's in the crystallization of the ideas that and seeing where there's solidarity and what we can do together, that then clarity comes. But it really must start at an organizational and even at an individual level. We have to really have that reflection point and to see what am I trying to solve? What am I trying to address? Am I putting the community's needs first? And how can I then take this work forward? I think it's very important. Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to go to Miriam, go to Taurai, and then come to Pap. In a succinct way, what does this blueprint look like? Rose said we know what we need to do, and we've been talking about this for a long time. And in talking about it for a long time, now today is the day that we're starting. Today is our May Organization of African Unity. What does that look like for us?
Thank you very much, Nyasha. This is so timely for a couple of reasons. I am currently in Cairo for the African Philanthropic Conference and have spent the last 5 days surrounded by powerful African leaders, African civil society organizations, African networks, and the blueprint is all we've been talking about. And I was about to tell Grace that, I think you talked about immense grief. This is at the beginning, but then you seem to be very enthusiastic and optimistic about the future. That's exactly the atmosphere that we've been feeling here. There's extreme optimism. People feel like this was a wake-up call, but this is also an opportunity to reimagine how the future can look like for Africans, because it will be led by Africans and for Africans. And the type of funding that Africans were managing up until now was not with sustainability in mind, which is why this survey is so important, because it doesn't just tell us what happened and the extent of the impact, but it also talks about what Pap talked about, the root causes, the why, and what we can do differently going forward. So very honored and humbled to be here and to be learning from all of you.
Thank you. Dr. Taurai.
Thank you. I think the previous speakers have highlighted most of the things I had in mind, but more importantly, I would suggest that a blueprint should not be a static kind of document or roadmap. It should be a living document so that it remains responsive to the changing environment as well as the needs. Then the other part is also to say it should be inclusive, rather involving, so that we consider different sectors, like I think previous speakers have indicated, would need the government. I think Pape indicated that as we do our programming, all along, most of it has been led by bigger organizations, by donors. But if we bring the government into the play, it becomes easier for that blueprint to be owned by different nations. Then lastly, is to say amongst ourselves as NGOs, CSOs, looking at the cake which is now being availed to us is no longer as big as it used to be. So we now need to move away from a competitive approach, but to start thinking of a collaborative kind of approach, to the extent that regarding the resources which we'll be getting, we will be able to share that amongst ourselves. But more importantly, for the work which we'll be doing, the reach will be also expanded, and also sustainability becomes much easier out of that collaboration and moving away from the competition. Back to you, Nyash.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Collaboration approach. Pap, I come to you.
Yeah.
Blueprint.
Yeah, and I think the ground is being laid out. But I want to do a couple of things. First of all, I wanted to, again, I don't want to give the impression that Africa want to work in the vacuum, or we don't want to be isolationist or anything. Africa has so much contributions to make to change the current global development architecture. We still believe in the global development architecture. Development will only happen if countries and individuals can learn from each other. Africa needs the expertise and the resources, financials and otherwise, from the rest of the world. I want to take this opportunity also to celebrate and thank our many, many, many donors, including lots of philanthropists out there who want to do it right. In fact, who've been the catalyst of this movement to change the paradigm, because they want their investment to go directly to the people that want it. So Africa wants to continue to be a global player and influence the rest of the world as well. So I want to just make that clear. Here to hear Mariam reporting a little bit on what's happening in that meeting she's attending, because it shows that we have a momentum and we do have what it takes. And the mindset, the right mindset, is beginning to settle. It's beginning. We still have lots of work, believe me. We still have a lot of unlearning to do, and we still have to fight for our ideas and our values to be prevalent. So now for the blueprint, to me, that's what it's about. It is about allowing Africa to play the crucial role it needs to play in the world. That's where it's going to play out, folks. When it comes to human resources, when it comes to talent, when it's come to fresh ideas and stuff, Africa is the continent everybody is looking at. So it behooves us to look at it even better and even more strongly. That's what it is. So for me, a blueprint should be the vehicle for civil society organizations to do their right part. But right now, the conditions have not been ideal for us to do our work. As I said, the majority of us are made up because we're an offshoot of other organizations. We are highly fragile. we are fragmented. We still have a lot of governance issues too. So we need to clean house and we need to strengthen that system. But that's what it is. That's why this blueprint is so important. But the blueprint need not to be just be defensive or, I did not have a response to that question about how did we get here, because I think it was a natural evolution of things. In a way, a little bit of me is saying it's a good thing we got here. I wish it was differently. I wish it was in a different manner. It was not this brusque and it did not involve losing people, frankly. But it needed to happen. And like Mariam, I see this as an opportunity to do things right. So when I think about the blueprint, that's what I think about. How can African civil society organizations and the civil society sector be the best mover and shaker and catalyst it can be? Because the potential has been there for the last half a century or so, but it cannot be business as usual because we're going to lose a lot of time, lose a lot of life, lose a lot of momentum, and have slower economic growth. So the Africa we want is an Africa where we play the role we know we can play and the role we should play. So I hope our energy goes that way. But I'm very excited about it, and I think there is a lot of work. And I agree with Grace. We need to be talking to each other a lot more, because otherwise other people, we just don't have the forum. Things are decided in New York and Geneva, and we are left out of that conversation. Or those of us that represent, that have a chance to be there, never have an opportunity to really share it real life. So I think we need to continue to strengthen our partnership, to put our ideas in front, to show the world that civil society organization is not just to implement ideas and strategies that were developed by others, but it should start with ideas, strategies, and activities that were developed by us.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. As I think to round that off, from what everyone is saying, we're here now. It wasn't a soft landing, right? It was a very rough landing, and it came at a cost. It came at a cost of lives, human lives. And so as we begin this conversation, as we begin this blueprint process, I invite us to all hold both the grief and the grit that it's going to take to honor what's been lost, but also to imagine what we can build. We're in a moment where I'd like to now invite everyone that's on the call now, people that have questions, getting into our question and answer section, while we have our panelists as well, and also inviting back Rose and Bernard into this conversation as well, as we start this process, inviting our funders, inviting civil society, inviting government, inviting corporate Africa to this table, this blueprint table. And I love what's happening in the chat right now. I think Rose and David, it looks like right now the blueprint is writing itself. It is, everyone is participating, and it's right, it's here. So Mariam, other funders that are on the table, guys, we have more work to do. Here's the blueprint. Okay. Rose, I've got a question that is in the box which says, have you noted a move towards civil society organizations merging, going into some sort of mergers within this within the report? Is that something that came out?
Not yet. What we've seen, and certainly we didn't ask that question in our survey, but anecdotally and from organizations that I know, more of what I've seen is like a bigger organization that is still able to be on its feet is hosting others. So there's one particular case where this organization has moved into, they were given a small office space by another organization. So things like that, but real kind of mergers are not yet. But I know there are movements and organizations that are now offering services to organizations that are considering that as an option. Yeah. Why am I not on the screen?
Then there is a question here that also is asking in the chat, how do we change the way we lead our organizations to meet this challenge? This speaks to leadership. David, is there anything from your side? And maybe either David or Miriam can answer this question. How do we lead organizations differently through this challenge?
I'm happy for Miriam to take that question.
Thank you. It's actually fresh on my mind because this was also a topic at the conference with collective thinking in mind. It's no longer organizations with one leader at the top with the ideas, but really not just working with the rest of their team, but also other organizations in partnership. The space is getting small. To the question around merger, this did come up also, and as a very positive opportunity to keep the collective agency, wisdom, knowledge alive, and making a parallel with what's happening in the corporate sector. It's not a bad thing when two good organizations merge. Sadly, for the ones who have to fold, also finding a way to retain and document all the knowledge that has happened over the years. And so collective ownership and leadership, transparency, and all for the goal of sustainable architecture for the continent.
I see in the question in the Q&A chat box, Florence in Burkina Faso kind of concurring with you, Pape, and saying that, this comes at the right time for us as well, right? It also signifies our own sovereignty. And I think maybe I would want to hear from either Rose or David. Is this something that you saw also maybe in some of the qualitative answers that came through within the report, people saying that this does come in also at a right time and it's time for us to act in a different way and move forward with our sovereignty as Africa?
I can take, go for it, Rose.
Go, David. I was just going to say that kind of yes and no. But the overwhelming sentiment actually is that, yeah, it's terrible how this thing happened. And the abruptness of it and the cruelty of it was shocking. But that it happened or was going to happen sometime when funding would dry out, that has always been an increasingly, and again, we saw it in COVID, things can change like that. Many of the answers we got is like, no, this is a wake-up call. Yeah, it's tough, but we've been forced to this place, but we needed to get here. Maybe not in the way we've gotten here, but we needed to get here. We're really, really serious introspection about how we sustain the work that we do.
Yeah, and what I would add to that is, I think on one level, the survey was very much about understanding the impact, almost the negative, but where we asked people to really reflect on where to from here. I think the stats or the comments around the interest in partnering, the interest in sharing, the interest in looking at African solutions. I think there were some very deep insights where people were allowed to kind of just reflect also on their own experiences. And maybe, a report in itself doesn't always do justice to that side. But I don't think that it's as serious as the impact and the implications might be. It's also not a hopeless sector. I think Rose or someone else also, it's not a hopeless sector. There's a lot of resilience. There's a lot of expertise. There's a lot of commitment to change things around. And it's just a question of how do you bring, those values and that intent together. Then I think there is a way forward. Maybe in that process, there will be need for things like mergers. Maybe there's not space for everyone to continue. But on the flip side, there's also many new other ways where organizations can be supporting one another. I think the concept like fiscal hosting on this continent, where big organizations almost have an obligation to support small organizations, taking them under their wing. So I think there's also creative ways of drawing on the collective expertise and helping small organizations, newcomers, or people that just don't have that kind of formal infrastructure.
If I may add a little bit on that, I totally agree. I think where we have the most momentum is collective actions and generating collective actions. I think, let's face it, the urgency of the work that we're doing in this sector, the fact that things have been designed before they get to, and then many people see the CSOs mostly as implementing organizations. These are all issues that are also recognized. And frankly, that did not leave much time for very, still fragile, small organizations to do a lot of the thinking. So I think we now have an opportunity to start with a blank slate. I mean, there's still good things we need to carry on, but we do have an opportunity and we do have new energy. We have youth and youthful population. We've got digitalization. We've got artificial intelligence. We've got a new toolbox for doing things. So I think creating these opportunities to take advantage of this new energy. I mean, the whole sector in the last 10 years have changed because of people who have entered this. The lines have been blurred between the private sector and the not-for-profit sector. So these are all kind of new opportunities when you think about it that we did not have just some short 15 years ago or so. So I do think the opportunities to create something new are there, and we should not hesitate. I mean, I know it takes resources to do it, but in Senegal, we just before the end of the year in November, we had a 2-day powwow with about 50 CSOs doing all sorts of work, and we just wanted to talk about what is this term localization means to you. It was incredible, the stuff that came out of there. And it's amazing what you're gonna get if you create an environment to begin to hear people. Because what we did before, we did not have these kinds of conversation. we had conversations with our donors and with our governments about how to implement a maternal and child program or how to advance family planning. But I think we need to have, now we have an opportunity, we have a space, and I think the blueprint could be a vehicle, or the process of developing a blueprint could be a vehicle for more of this type of conversation. But they're needed, in my opinion, and helpful.
I have 1 minute to go, and otherwise I will never get another moderating job again. Rose and Mariam, I'm going to end off with you and say, if you're to bring two stakeholders, I just need two stakeholders from each one of you to come and be part of the table at this blueprint. Who would they be besides civil society organizations? Who would they be? I'll start off with you, Mariam, and then we'll go to Rose, and then I will close off. Just two.
Yeah, just two. I mean, governments, because nothing happens without governments. And the other piece I picked in the chat, and there was a question around African philanthropy and why aren't we as Africans contributing ourselves? Why do we always rely on outside funding? And I beg to differ. I feel like I know that we have been contributing in a number of ways, informally, formally, structured ways, for the development of our communities. And so whatever that entity is, our African philanthropy, the savings groups, the village banks, that's who I would have as one entity at the table with the government.
Thank you. Rose, I'm going to end off with you. Two stakeholders.
Two stakeholders. For me, the two stakeholders, obviously, like Mariam, I agree, government needs to be there. They have to roll, and our sector hasn't been very good about talking to or collaborating with government for historic reasons that we know. And then I would really look at an individual African leaders, people of influence and wealth, and bring them to the table. Like we have these African foundations, but I don't know, but also, and I don't know who would represent this, and this is why we need an ecosystem, so that there are actors who can represent others. In our research, we found that actually there's really extensive individual giving to African civil society organizations. I don't know if you've seen our report from last year that showed that 65% of those that participated in a huge survey that we did said that actually individuals were among, or just ordinary individuals were among the top sources of funding for them, sometimes the number one. And I can tell you anecdotally, I've met many organizations that say, we have 400, I know one in Kenya that has 400 individual donors, just ordinary people who give regularly. So I think so I don't know who would represent that, but we certainly need to bring our influential Africans to the table, and they need to be part of this conversation. Yeah.
Thank you. Please note, we've come to the end, but you can stay on for a little bit longer. But as I close off and hand back to Rose, I want to thank everyone for being part of this. I think also a round of applause for our esteemed panelists, and also for thank you so much to Firelight, Mariam, your organization. I think that funding this type of work is so important and it's so crucial, and it comes at a very, very crucial time for our continent, but also for our sector as well. David, Rose, thank you for bringing out this report and just the insight that it brings, and creating a space where we can have this table that we want to speak about this blueprint. And from this point onwards, let this not be another conversation. My challenge to everyone is, let this not be another conversation, and then we say 5 years from now, remember the blueprint of 2025. What happened to the blueprint of 2025? We are at a space now where we could do something different. A couple of months ago, I was at a conference where someone said, one of our provocateurs said, Santa is not coming. So, Africa, Santa is not coming. What does that mean for us? Let's actually come to the table and come to the party and do this together. I hand back to you, Rose. Thank you very much for inviting me. I am very honored to have been part of this conversation.
Thank you so much, Nyasha. And mine is very quick, is really to thank everyone, starting with our audience, for showing up and staying, through this timely conversation, and for your, engagement and thoughtful questions, which we may not be able to answer all of them, but we hope to continue engaging. Thank you to our incredible speakers. And thank you, Nyasha, for the impeccable moderation. And of course, I want to thank my colleagues, the EPIC team, starting with David, the others that you don't see on the screen, Joyce, Paul, Noella, Brian, Sega, who are supporting the webinar from the backs. Thank you so much. The report will be shared. All of you registered to be in this webinar, and we will email you the link to the report. We also urge you, if you haven't already done so, to please register on our African CSO platform. And registration is free, and it's open to all entities that are interested in learning about engaging our sector. And finally, just to say, here's to building the blueprint for African CSO sustainability. So stay tuned. Yeah, so whoever wants to stay back, David and I, and even the speakers, if any of you wants to hang back, you're welcome. So for another 20 or so minutes to answer any burning questions.
Okay. Thank you.
I'm looking at the questions. Nyasha, did you have any on your list that went unanswered? Some of these are comments, they're not questions.
Grace has a question.
Yeah,
Yes,
yes. Not really a question, but a comment. And I was glad to see quite a number of questions around Africa resources. I think there are conversations ongoing about how there can be greater engagement around securing African resources that really should go towards the development work that is needed for Africa. So just to spotlight that, I think we need to talk more about conversations that are happening, thought pieces, and people who are working even around building resilience. We just need to get that information out there, that there is work happening in some of these spaces. But thank you so much for the opportunity to speak today. Thank you.
And that could be the as we think of the blueprint, and by the way, David and I are not planning to go lock ourselves somewhere and write a blueprint. It's it's all of us. We're happy to provide the space and the process, but it's not an Epic Africa blueprint. No, it's an African civil society blueprint, and obviously a first place to start is just to scan the landscape, like where are the conversations, who is involved, who should be coming to the table, and that sort of thing. We obviously hope, particularly for, and you had a call to action, Nyasha, for those funders who may have joined us, and I know there were a couple that had registered. Yeah, just to consider also supporting this process of producing the blueprint, because it's going to require time and some expertise to put the building blocks together.
Yeah. I hope we had in the audience people who are in a position to think about supporting this initiative, because I know that's not typically where donors put their money. They want to put them in specific programs. But there is a need, because it does take resources to support effort like this. I truly believe it's important. Having lived and worked in the US for so long, and having served on the board of Interaction, the largest association of NGOs in the US, for 2 consecutive terms, I can tell you there's a lot of values in having a framework or having a, having a mechanism for capturing all these wonderful ideas. And I'm serious. We don't, because if it's a luxury for all of us, but I think it is a necessary step if we wanted to work and influence the sector. Because first of all, our organization tend to be very small, and we're struggling just to to live day to day. So it will be helpful to have support, at least initial support, for something like this. And I hope we had good ears in the audience and potential supporters for something like that. But if anybody has creative ideas, I mean, I think there are always ideas now, especially leveraging technology and virtual meetings and so forth. But yeah.
I think, some of us who've been really advocating for the need, for investment in philanthropy infrastructure is so that there can be institutions that exist to now take something like this and do something with it, because, diversify funding. Okay, you've told me to diversify funding. I'm a small organization. I have 3 people. I don't even know where to start. So who is it that's telling me, okay, you know what? These are the 500 potential funders of African organizations. This is what they fund, because I don't have time to do that. So then we say, let's collaborate. But collaboration means, somebody following up, calling up people, making the meetings, and all of those things. And those things are not funded. Where the infrastructure is not funded. It's seen as a luxury, but for us at Epic Africa, we consider it actually, and we have described it as the plumbing. So when you're building, when you go to the bathroom or to your kitchen and you turn on the water, it flows. You only know that there's plumbing in the wall when it's jammed, right? But that's what makes all the roads we drive on that we take for granted. So if we don't have the infrastructure, then we can keep hitting ourselves on the head like, oh, we need to collaborate. But
that's right.
Building that. So I think that it's important to also it's not that we don't want to collaborate or we want to work in silos, but there is that connecting glue does not exist, or is still just emerging. Yeah.
Right.
And I think just to hit on what you're saying right now, Rose, the glue is not connecting because we also we've decided not to make a concerted effort to connect it. Our terminology across the continent is different. So any type of collaboration then becomes quite difficult. Bringing, when we're talking about two stakeholders that come to this, I think it is important for spaces like ECOWAS to be part of this. It's not just individual governments, but it's also like the collectives, the SADCs, the African Union, them also coming to the party and coming to play, those big bodies as well that bring in the collaboration of our governments. The United Nations, what part does it play in all of this? Because again, they work in a lot of the global south, a lot of Africa. What space are they creating on the table? Are they just going to be intermediaries? But then our terminology also needs to be the same throughout. We need to start making the connections throughout. And the bodies that do work across the continent need to also come to the party. It can't be isolated, because even the isolated foundations or the isolated funding bodies or the funding bodies that exist in specific spaces only, or in specific countries only, can only come so far as to mimic those that work across the continent because they've got more data about what it's like to work across the continent. So coming to the party means everyone is actually joining the dots, seeing themselves as the glue, and starting to speak one language, because divided we fall, but united we will stand. And we sit here right now, we are all working towards being ancestors of future generations. Where are you going to be written? Where is your name going to be written? Are you going to be among them that change this? I don't like it when people just keep quiet after I say
They're waiting for their turn. But Yasha, I mean, maybe I'm really optimist here. I think it's starting. I really think that up until now, we did not have the space or the pressure to be working together. But here I am in Cairo, and I'm telling you, we were having the exact same conversations that we're having now. So the glue is starting to take shape, I think. You also said in your moderation, Yasha, that the blueprint is being written, and I was scrolling through the chat, and it is kind of all there. It has to be put together, and I think, there's also some comments around regional or continent-wide networks. So APN is being mentioned. It was also mentioned here. If we could find one entity that could represent all of the African CSOs that either has the resources or the capacity to handle resources to be leading this process, I think we'd be on our way. So I choose to be optimistic about it all.
I agree with you. Yeah, it's not like there's nothing there. It's just nascent, and itself needs to be strengthened to in fact play these roles. I mean, what has been really interesting to observe is all this is happening, but and there is no entity, or there are few entities that can stand up and speak for the sector. And sometimes, governments ask, and I've been asked this question, so who represents your sector? Like, who represents your sector? Like, we can talk to the million of you. So we need to organize. We need to organize, right? Like, we need to organize. We need, yeah. Grace has a hand up.
Yes, and I think not from a point of rhetoric, but a point of acknowledgement that, well, for myself, getting older, we really need to get younger people in this conversation because they see things from a completely different perspective. So even as we're working on the blueprint, we need to recognize it's the blueprint. It might not be us who implement it or see the fruits of it. So we really need to have them with us in these conversations because they don't allowedly, they don't see things the way we see it because of where we have come from and our biases and what we've experienced. And I think that if there's something that we must learn is that we really need to be a bit more inclusive in our conversations. That will bring the different viewpoints, the flexibility, the innovation, and really start the Africa conversation. I mean, if there's anything I feel very strongly about is as Africa, we really need to start saying, where's the money? Where's our money? Where is it going to? And let me end by saying this. I think what David mentioned, that a lot of people didn't want to fill in the survey because of any backlash or that's something that we must look into. Well, I would care to speak out because what might happen to us, we might not receive funding. I think we really need to have spaces to talk about these things and see how we can continuously help each other. Thank you.
David, you want to say something?
No, I've listened, I think to Miriam and your point, I don't think there's a lack of entities that are already in some form or shape, either driving conversations, representing people, etc., etc., be it at civil society level, at the philanthropy level, etc., etc. There was one very interesting comment in the chat around the issue of civic space. And I think that in many ways is the elephant in the room. That philanthropy and civil society can almost coordinate and mobilize. But if something doesn't enable them or allow them to take these things to its logical conclusion, then to the point that Grace just made, then you get stuck in those issues that even if people are willing to move forward, they also have to be realistic in terms of keeping their doors open, because if their doors are closed, then then there's almost a missed opportunity in terms of their presence, their participation, and their contribution. So I think maybe that's also to Pop's kind of initial comments about just taking one step back. What are the stumbling blocks? Because we have many building blocks, but what I say the stumbling blocks that can prevent or would prevent the building blocks to really prosper and move us forward.
Yeah, including really continuing to work on our value add, because I think that question, it is the elephant in the room. I think, yeah, unfortunately, it's sad, but the space has been closing rather than opening for civil society. In my own country, I was in shock last week when I heard very high level government person talk about the need to take a closer look about who's funding the NGO sector. And I said, whoa, wait a minute. Fine, it's fair game, but it's just there's a lot of work to do. And especially with government, I think patching things up, developing greater trust. I think it's important to do that groundwork because unfortunately, we are in a sector that's been politicized too. And people don't make the difference between, human right focus or people, and they lump us all together, which is fine by me, by a certain point. But what do we do to take care of those stumbling blocks that are still on the road for really clearing the space so that we can do the work properly in the country? So we probably need some strong allies. When you were suggesting bringing government into the conversation, I think it was Mariam. Right. We need some champions. We need some government champions who could speak for, it's a difficult sector. Let's face it. But how do we provide people with ways of filtering or doing whatever they need to do? But it's not fair to lump us all, and then in the end we all lose, because then people don't trust civil society organization. And that's, the reality is government will never be able to do its work without the support. And it's really a collective effort. And I think we need to create the space so that everybody can do their part. I mean, I don't think it's much to ask, but that's what it is. So lots of work.
Lots of work, and we have to. I think our sector also hasn't like we don't. And speaking for myself, we don't really understand how government works. So even who are we? Where the levers, and we also kind of go there with. Like we have to understand what are the incentives for them, and how do we speak to government? And one question that again I get asked when I talk to government people is like, what does your sector do? Like, what's your collective impact? And I can tell them about how wonderful Epic Africa is and how we're changing the world, but I can't speak in terms of, especially in terms that they understand. And so one of the reasons that we are really trying to build data on the sector, who's who, what do we do, is the day I think we can be able to come to the table and say, in Senegal or Kenya or whatever country, do you know that this sector is employing 50,000 people? And you can multiply that, how many livelihoods, with the high dependency ratios in Senegal. So one person is taking care of another 20 people, right? We can't come to the table and say, we buy goods and services. I mean, there are times when in Dakar, you can't get a hotel room because there are meetings. Who's meeting? It's development people, right? So if because that's kind of the line. So when we go to the ministry and say, oh, we should not pay taxes because we are non-profit, they're like, show me, like, so I think we also have some, there's also some internal work that needs to happen, and a real strategy for engaging government that meets them where they are. Obviously, of course, if it's a repressive government, they want to get rid of us, they will, but I think we kind of make it easy for them to do it.
That's right.
And when they attack one of us, there's no one to say, no, you can't do that because we all kind of, so there's work to, there's introspection and work that hopefully the blueprint process can begin to explore this these different blockers, if you will, but also opportunities to move forward. Okay, Nyasha, are we still?
I think we're good to go.
Yeah, we still
but I
have
just
people.
want I absolutely want to give, sorry, I want to give a shout out to a participant, Stacy. Stacy Jones, you have been, yes. So she's going to be at the blueprint table.
Sure.
I'm also in Cape Town, Stacy, if you're still on the call. But yes, I think most of our questions have been answered, and I think it was a very insightful conversation, and I think the conversation needs to happen again. Back to you, David and Rose. Back to you guys. Like, when will we do this again? Miriam, when will you enable this to happen again? Speak to your people, and the people will speak to their people.
Well, let me start by saying thank you. Thank you to all of you. I mean, this was fantastic. I almost wish it could have been more interactive because I was following the chat. Such a rich conversation. I'm very grateful for your moderation, Yasha, and Rose and David, for all of the insights you brought in. This was really, somebody said in the chat, this was an epic moment.
It is, an epic conversation.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Thank you, and thank you, Epic. Thank you, NGO, African NGO, and thank you, Mariam. It was nice to meet you all.
Nice to meet you all.
Okay, bye-bye. Bye, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
And, stay tuned. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Nyasha.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. You're muted, my dear, I think. Yeah, you're muted.
I was saying to Paul, we're still on YouTube.